Here's your report.
Oh, thanks, Jane. I wish I could hire someone just like you.
Try LinkedIn Hiring Pro. It's more than a job board. It's like the recruiter you always wished you had. Hiring Pro uses real-time insights to match your role to LinkedIn's unique network of professionals and delivers a short list of best fit candidates. You'll spend less time sorting applicants and more time talking to the right people.
Let's do it. You're irreplaceable, Jane, but another you would be great.
Hire right the first time. Post your job for free on LinkedIn today at linkedin.com/quality.
This episode is brought to you by Accenture. When your advertising operations fall out of sync, everything else follows. Spotify and Accenture are working together to reinvent the rhythm of ad sales, using automation, analytics, and smarter workflows to simplify campaign delivery and access better data across the business. The result? Less time spent on operations, more time connecting brands with the moments and fandoms that matter most. Learn more at accenture.com/Spotify.
This episode is brought to you by Perfect Bistro Cat Food. Hey guys, today I'm interviewing my cat about his perfect bistro food. Percy, you seem to be a big Perfect Bistro fan. Care to comment? Totally. What do you like about it? You love the high-quality ingredients? And the delicious flavors, of course. Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. Listen to Percy, guys. Visit perfectbistro.com to try it for your cat.
Welcome to the New Books Network.
I'm Chris Holmes, and this is Burned by Books. Here you'll find interviews with writers you already love, like Jennifer Egan and Rebecca Mackay, mixed in with up-and-coming voices like Alexandra Kleeman and Rumaan Alam. You'll find us wherever you listen to podcasts, but check out previous episodes at burnedbybooks.com and on Instagram and Twitter at burnedbybooks. Let's start the show. Queen Mab, Emily McBride's debut novel, brings the Queen of the Fairies into the life of Madeleine, a doctoral student in England whose existence is about to be turned upside down by the birth of her daughter Maud. Madeleine, it seems, is not terribly sure that this baby is hers. In fact, she begins to believe it may not be human at all, but a creature left by the fairy midwife as an evil stand-in. Madeleine's own childhood mythology, adopted and cut off from any information about her birth mother, feeds into her obsession over origin stories, her own and her child's. Bracketed by signals of her once ordinary life with her loving husband Tom, and her student peers in the doctoral program, and fantasies of evil fairies and their fox factotums, Madeleine's sense of what is real begins to unravel in ways that are poignant and horrifying. Her companions in this descent are the works of literature that run through her head, poems and novel snippets that conjure evil spirits and maternal madness from every dark corner of her mind. A novel as much about the reality of postpartum depression and the savage loneliness of early motherhood as it is a midsummer fantasy of the dark deeds of fairies, Queen Mab works its hallucinogenic magic on the reader as we worry over and care for Madeleine at her worst. Beautifully written and carefully crafted to never let us loose on either side of the veil, Emily McBride's debut is a wonderful addition to an increasing canon of maternal horrors. Emily McBride is a Canadian-born editor, writer, and translator living in Barcelona. Her work has been published in The Nation, The Rumpus, and The Stinging Fly. Queen Mab is her debut novel. Welcome to Burned by Books, Emily McBride.
Thank you very much, and thank you for that wonderful introduction.
I would love if you would start for us by reading a section of Queen Mab. And this one I'm thinking of is just after the birth of her daughter Maud, and she is at work contemplating this new existence.
Yes, of course. This is, I believe, chapter 5 or 6 of Queen Mab. On the 8th day, Madeleine, Maddie, Mads, Queen Mab, Queenie, Madeleine F. Brodeur, 23-year-old promising doctorate student, sat upon her hospital bed, holding the infant on her lap, staring into the small face as though searching for something. Time passes, she was thinking. The famous middle section of To the Lighthouse, after pages and pages of minutiae about a dinner party, in which suddenly the war sweeps in, and the old times are past, and characters die, 3 of them, in parentheses no less. It was one of the texts that had made her want to expand her studies into the non-human, telling of the catastrophe of humanity through descriptions of fallen plaster and the matriarch's moth-eaten clothes. Well, she felt as though time had passed. Wolfe squeezed a decade into a few pages. Madeleine's week felt like a decade. Little had happened, yet everything was changed. Her body, her dreams, even the baby looked different. Everyone said they changed so fast, but it had startled her this morning when they had brought the baby back to her. Tom was once more on the uncomfortable plastic chair at the foot of the bed, flipping through pictures of the baby on his camera. He was deciding which met his standards of composition and delicate newborn beauty, and he was frowning because newborn beauty proved elusive. Every so often he looked up and his eyes met Madeleine's, and they smiled, though they were looking at one another across a great distance. The distance of days spent sleeping apart, on different rhythms, in different worlds. Madeleine had been hospitalized all week, in a vague and drugged state after further surgery to drain an infection in the C-section cut. Just this morning, she had suddenly been made responsible for the baby again. Tom had spent the week as a child, playing host to his own mother, who was meant to be helping with a grandchild, absent, also hospitalized, declared complication-free on the same day as Madeleine. Tom's mother had returned home to Wales yesterday. She would be back when she had holidays in July, and Tom's precious parental leave was half over. The baby was the brick-red color of most newborns, and when awake had tenebrous grey eyes. Madeleine kept a cotton cap pulled down over the baby's hair, which was black and shocking and flyaway, like an 80s music star or a troll doll. It made the baby look unfamiliar, though unfamiliar compared to what? Perhaps simply to her preconception of what a baby looked like. She tucked a stray tendril under and reached towards a book. The baby stirred, and Madeleine looked down into the little pursed face. The baby's features clouded, with pain or anger or some malevolent force. A small wail, gaining in pitch and intensity, was emitted. Tom glanced up and clucked soothingly. Madeleine unhooked her nursing bra and lifted the baby. The doctors had suggested there might be difficulties establishing breastfeeding after a week of tubes, but the baby had emerged from her incubator ravenous, with her tiny mouth opening and closing onto nothing until Madeleine was able to organize herself. Tom stretched. They're taking ages. Whenever they say they'll be back in 10 minutes, you can be sure you won't see them all morning. They said we'd be discharged today, but I'll believe it when I see it. Madeleine's thoughts were scattered. She stared at the wall until the words penetrated. Do you think you could give me my book? Tom picked up the book, opened it, and placed it in her cocked and waiting left hand, taking the opportunity to run a gentle finger over the baby's forehead. Let me know when you want a page turned, he said. He had his laptop out and was editing photos. Which of these do you prefer? He turned the computer to scan between 3 similar baby portraits. Your mom and dad sent me an email last night asking for more pictures. Of course, she smiled. They were coming next week. Her mother had been messaging obsessively. Through Tom, she had already made a first gift, a playlist of folk songs and lullabies, some classics, some very obscure, and a couple that her mother had even recorded herself singing. And your dad wrote back to ask that he wants all the details so we can enter her properly into his fancy family tree. Madeleine's smile faded. As long as he's not buying her a DNA test. Tom giggled. It was one of many endearing features that his laugh was so joyful and so unmasculine, and that he never tried to curb it. I did wonder if we should add a few middle names so she'd look impressive on his scroll or whatever, he said. I wouldn't get in a huff about it. He's a man with lots of interests. He'll find something else to focus on. He'll either hit a wall or learn the relatives were all boring and leave it be. Unless he discovers you can trace the family back to William the Conqueror, that is. Even a whiff of that, and you'll never hear the end of it.
Thank you so much, Emily. I wanted to talk for a moment about the reference to the time passes section of To the Lighthouse, because it provides a very interesting analogy for Madeleine's preoccupation with how her experience of time has changed radically since the birth of her child. She becomes weighed down by time, which passes both slowly while seeming to contain mighty and important changes. How did you want to deal with the powerful manipulation of time that comes with an infant?
Right. So Madeleine is a scholar of the modernists, and a lot of modernist literature is about the reaction to the sort of destruction of selfhood in Europe of the First World War. Now, having a baby is not the same as the First World War, of course, but it is a sort of extreme exterior shock to the system. They've done studies that show that having a baby can be more shocking or more destabilizing, or that having a baby can destabilize a person more than a divorce or a death in the family. So it's something that really has an outsized effect on a person's world. And so this section from Time Passes, from To the Lighthouse, called Time Passes by Virginia Woolf, struck me as very interesting, precisely because it deals with a massive upheaval, but it does it in a very small way. And in a way, the arrival of a baby into a family is something that happens to many, many people every day. And it's a very small thing, but it feels like a very outsized event. So I kind of wanted to play with these elements of time, with this kind of bigness and smallness, because of course a baby is also very small. And also because I think time takes on a new meaning with a newborn. Although everyone around you is telling you.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Everyone around you is telling you all the time that, that they grow up so fast, that you should take lots of pictures because they'll be changing every second of every day and they'll look so different in just a few weeks. And yet time seems kind of eternal because you find yourself suddenly being awake for long stretches in the middle of the night, and life has completely changed and things are strangely boring much of the time and marvelous as well, but in different ways. So I felt that playing with time and the conception of time was one way to kind of approach that.
Yeah, I found it very, very effective. And I've always found the Time Passes section of To the Lighthouse to be remarkable for how much emotional weight it carries, almost as an afterthought or a parenthetical. And I loved the way that it was operating there and continues to. We can't really understand the novel without coming to terms with Queen Mab herself and thinking about her as both famously of Romeo and Juliet, as the fairy midwife, and, a feature of English folklore. But in this novel, the figure that's crucial to understanding Madeleine's mental anguish. Can you tell us a little bit about the history of Queen Mab and then talk about why the fairy queen became so central to the novel?
So Queen Mab is, as you say, described as the fairy's midwife in Romeo and Juliet, which ties her, of course, to childbirth. And yet what she is a midwife of is dreams. So this also ties her to the world of magic, of things that are sort of half glimpsed but not entirely understood. And in this sense, she seemed like a very relevant figure for a story about the sort of disassociation that takes place after a baby is born, and at a time when you are perhaps not dreaming or even sleeping very much, and yet every image is kind of extra weighted. She's also a fairy from Old English folklore, and the fairies of Old English folklore are not the fairies that we necessarily think of, small gossamer creatures, the size of a button or something with little wings. The fairies of English folklore are kind of a little bit more menacing, mischievous, certainly. They like to do things like spoil your milk or your beer or play tricks on animals. So they are much more something to be cautious around than the later Victorian fairies. And Madeleine, throughout the course of this book, kind of has a crash course in all the different kinds of fairies. And also, it seemed a great opportunity because her name is Madeleine, which is not so far off from Mab, to make this kind of linkage between them. And Madeleine has many nicknames, as that section I read shows. And one of them is, in fact, Queen Mab.
Yeah, and it's Tom's endearing term for her, as much as Queen Mab becomes a feature of horror as things go along.
Yes, exactly. So the loved one and the life of affection is kind of subverted into this darkness.
That's nicely said. The other leitmotif in the novel is the changeling. And Madeleine worries to the point of hallucination that her daughter is a non-human entity left after a fairy steals her actual baby. But changelings are also literary stand-ins for orphans and adoptees. I'm thinking about Heathcliff in Wuthering Heights, for one. Thus, Queen Mab's interest in the tension between Madeleine and Maud as each a changeling of sorts. How do you understand that doubling in the work of the novel, with both Madeleine and Maud being kind of changelings?
Well, the entry point was the changeling as baby. I was attempting to find books about parental ambivalence shortly after I had had baby myself, and discovered that not only were there not a huge number of books at that time about parental ambivalence, but there were very few books with babies at all. I have always been a big fan of folklore and fairy tales, and so I did think of changelings, and I thought, actually, changelings are some of the few times babies are kind of centered in stories, at least older stories. And they're centered in this way that they're uncanny, they're other, they're unknowable and potentially dangerous. So that was very interesting. But yes, as you say, there is this other side of changelings, and Heathcliff is a prime example, the adult changeling who is out of place, sometimes of unknown origins, parachuted into another kind of community and not quite fitting. And so that sort of strand of Madeleine's identity came to me later, but it seemed to dovetail very well with the main storyline of the baby. And that's how it ended up developing in tandem with it.
Now that you say it, you're so right that there are so few literary works that have a central baby in it, and that, you know, it's something that happens often kind of off screen, and I wonder why that is.
It's funny because I read a few years ago Kate Briggs's book, The Long Form, which is also about a mother.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Have you read that?
I have. Yeah, it's very good.
Yeah, and it's also about a mother with a new baby, and she's also kind of trying to come to grips with the place of babies in literature. And she literally talks about the fact that oftentimes when a baby appears in a book, it is then quickly ushered off stage until it has grown up a bit and can come back and take place in the action. And the example she uses is Henry Fielding's Tom Jones, in which baby Tom is found in a bed and then hustled off stage for a while and comes back as an adult. This struck me as amazingly entertaining because I was actually in a production of Tom Jones when I was in high school, playing the role of Tom Jones's mother. And the baby was hustled off stage so fast that we literally threw the baby off stage. The baby was obviously not a baby doll, but the baby just sailed straight off the stage and came back as an adult. So I felt that was, I laughed a lot reading that because I just thought, yeah, they could not get the baby out of there fast enough. But of course, when you hustle the baby off stage, you also frequently hustle the baby's carer off stage. And therefore, you know, generally speaking, a woman loses protagonism for as long as it takes for the baby to grow up and get back on stage.
I'm not soon going to forget the flying baby leaving the stage. That's a really great image. And worth thinking about, as well as worth thinking about the you know, enormous lack of information that we get about feelings of ambivalence in motherhood. But we can come back to that subject.
Here's your report.
Oh, thanks, Jane. I wish I could hire someone just like you.
Try LinkedIn Hiring Pro. It's more than a job board. It's like the recruiter you always wished you had. Hiring Pro uses real-time insights to match your role to LinkedIn's unique network of professionals and delivers a short list of best fit candidates. You'll spend less time sorting applicants and more time talking to the right people.
Let's do it. You're irreplaceable, Jane, but another you would be great.
Hire right the first time. Post your job for free on LinkedIn today at linkedin.com/quality.
This episode is brought to you by Accenture. When your advertising operations fall out of sync, everything else follows. Spotify and Accenture are working together to reinvent the rhythm of ad sales, using automation, analytics, and smarter workflows to simplify campaign delivery and access better data across the business. The result? Less time spent on operations, more time connecting brands with the moments and fandoms that matter most. Learn more at accenture.com/Spotify.
This episode is brought to you by Perfect Bistro Cat Food. Hey guys, today I'm interviewing my cat about his perfect bistro food. Percy, you seem to be a big Perfect Bistro fan. Care to comment? Totally. What do you like about it? You love the high quality ingredients? And the delicious flavors, of course. Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. Listen to Percy, guys. Visit perfectbistro.com to try it for your cat.
I wanted to start with really what are the first 50 pages of the novel, which are given over to Madeleine's delivery, which is torturous and horrible and ends in a C-section. She describes the contractions of her uterine muscle as a hidden destructive element within her. The scene is really propulsive and hallucinatory. And I wanted to know a little bit about what it was like to write it, because it's really quite an extended scene, and whether you always knew it was going to be kind of framed as a sort of horror story.
Yes, I knew that the labor scene, that I wanted it to be intensive, horrifying, and very changing, because I think there's an argument to be made later that a big change takes place in the character as a result of that scene. And again, because I was writing this book in a time when there didn't seem to be a huge number of other books on the subject, and when I did read them, there weren't a huge number of them that dealt with labor. And labor is a very peculiar experience because it's very...
Peculiar is an interesting euphemism.
Yeah. It's a peculiar experience because it is both kind of lauded and eulogized in our culture and considered this sort of unspeakable thing that is, again, ushered off stage. So I knew I had to put it on stage. And the question simply became how. And I started by reading what I could, depictions of labor. Most of these things were things like blogs and personal accounts, because again, in literature, I didn't find very much. Curiously, one that I did find in literature was in an Émile Zola novel. So it was in fact written by a man.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and that was very curious. And it was about a maidservant who discovered sort of that morning that she was pregnant, trying to give birth in absolute silence before she goes and drops off the baby in a bush somewhere. So that was a hallucinatory experience, just reading that. But I approached it, of course, from the mother's perspective, the sort of immense change of self, I think, that can take place in being subjected to extreme pain, whilst being told that this is good pain, and perhaps finding that you are actually not up to the level of pain that is on offer. So those were the kind of the elements that I was predominantly playing with. But it's curious because it's kind of difficult to write about pain, I think, because pain is obviously a physical process. Reading is less of a physical process. And in the end, it sort of became necessary to mix Madeleine's physical pain with things that were causing her mental anguish, because those are perhaps easier to convey the level of pain in writing. And so the two are mixed together and hopefully work out.
Yeah. Elaine Scarry famously or infamously describes torture as pain that ends human language. And it's, you when you're tortured, you howl like a beast. And later on, Angela will describe to Madeleine birth as torturous as she has heard it from a friend of hers. And so perhaps similarly, it is a kind of difficult thing to describe because it involves pain so extreme that language ends.
Yeah. And I mean, it is different torture, of course, because in general, it leads to something which eventually becomes positive. But nonetheless, it is an extreme form of pain that many people undergo and that few people speak about afterwards in any detail.
One of Madeleine's hallucinations during her labor is of the baby foxes that live in her neighborhood. And foxes are linked to the work of fairies and changelings in literary history. And foxes are also, and this is, briefly referenced, figures of tricksterness and various kinds of mythologies in Japanese traditions, and really most cultures that have foxes have found ways to build them into these kinds of mythologies. And I wonder what you were thinking when you had Madeleine start to have this transposing of the baby foxes into her imagination of maternality.
So I think I was thinking that labor and early motherhood are very much about becoming an animal, or perhaps discovering that you were an animal all along. You're suddenly thrown into a very physical world, one of pain, but then later one of breastfeeding and just being sort of needed on a physical level for many years to come.
Hmm.
And I wanted the animals in question to be slightly mythical, as you say, with the foxes, but also urban animals, because I wanted it to be a very contemporary story set in a very modern environment in a city to kind of counterpose against the fairies and the mythology, and also to sort of make the point that these are ongoing things that people have been experiencing from rural times to urban times and every time in between. And so foxes were kind of perfect because they are both, as you say, very beloved or respected or at least considered in in mythology around the world, but they're also considered an urban pest in many parts of the world. They can be kind of mangy, they can be a bit scary just because they intrude into what we consider our human environment in unpredictable ways.
Mm-hmm.
And there are other animals like that in the book, a street cat, a pigeon, a fish. So there's various urban animals that accompany Madeleine on her journey of being an animal.
Yeah, we get the gray malkin, who is, the cat that figures in both in reality and in her fantasies as a kind of ominous figure. And gray malkin, as you show with your interweaving of so many interesting texts, both pre-modern and modern, has always sort of been hanging around the idea of motherhood. What's the cat doing there?
Well, cats are another one of these urban animals. I think there's a line in the book that says, "A cat and a fox together are never up to any good," which is sort of a reference to Pinocchio. But yes, in general, these are two kind of creatures that live in cities that are unpredictable and move through the margins. But also, Grey Malkin was Grey Malkin is the fairy cat in Scottish mythology. It's the witch's cat in Shakespeare and Macbeth. But also, my Grey Malkin turned out to be kind of a happy accident. I mean, the cat was there and I was using it. And then it turned out that Grey Malkin is a name that connects to the name Maud, which is a name I had already given to Madeleine's baby.
Oh, wow. Well, that's lovely.
There's a scene in which Madeleine discovers that in the book, which is very similar to the scene of me discovering that sort of 5 minutes before writing it. And that was one of those moments where I just thought, there's actually something magical going on here.
That's the best. If your book suddenly takes on, magical prominence and an imprimatur of legend, that's pretty great.
Yes, I felt like it was Grey Malkin telling me to carry on with that draft because it must be.
Yeah, clearly. I mean, as much as Queen Mab is playing throughout with various kinds of unreality, it's very much the story of postpartum depression, which often manifests as feelings of distance or numbness toward the newborn. And postpartum depression is understudied, and still very little is known about it. Does a fairy story here stand in a way for what science and medicine have refused to properly narrate?
As much as understudied, I would say that postpartum depression is incredibly common, affecting something between 1 in 10 and 1 in 4 women, with various degrees of seriousness, of course. And yet it does tend to be talked about either as something that everybody just goes through and you have to get over it. That would obviously be the lighter forms, the sort of baby blues, as they're called, or as something to simply be medicated away. However, it's not entirely. My understanding is that it's not entirely clear that this is entirely a medical event, or it is a medical event, and there is a medical cause for parts of it. But there's also, sort of a material cause for parts of it, that your life has been completely upended, that everything is changed. And so in a way, although it's taking you out of the world, it's also making you see it in a different way. And this is where I think the fairy tale aspect of it came in, and why I thought perhaps magic was a way to tell a kind of greater truth that science can explain, but maybe can't always explain in a way that is entirely true of somebody's lived experience.
Yeah, I like the way that you put that. The notion of a new mother's unraveling is not a new one in literary history, but recent novels like The Need by Helen Phillips or Rachel Yoder's Night Bitch have developed the idea of paranoia and transformation as fundamental to the nature of new motherhood. Do you see Queen Mab as part of a new tradition of narrating motherhood in these ways?
Yes, and it's curious because I'm not quite sure what was in the water that everybody suddenly had this realization that there was sort of a lack of stories being told in this way and decided to address this lack altogether. Because
Yeah, it's come in all kinds of interesting forms and seemingly all at once in maybe less than a decade, I feel like.
yes, exactly. It's very curious because I was looking, as I said, for stories of parental or maternal ambivalence in 2016, and there was really very little, or at least that I could find. And a decade later, there's many things, which I think is a good thing. And I think there's still room for quite a few more because there's never a limit to how many coming of age stories we could have, or divorce stories, or midlife crisis stories. And so I think there's much left to be excavated about early motherhood or postnatal depression or
Absolutely.
these kind of changes.
Madeleine is haunted both by thoughts of fairies, but also, I would argue, by literature. The novel is interwoven with citations of authors from the early moderns to contemporaries, and at times those stories creep fully into Madeleine's consciousness, taking over her story. Her life as a doctoral student seems to punish her in a way. She knows too many stories. How is this a story of literary hauntings?
I think it's very normal when you go through a large and destabilizing event to try and understand it according to the things that are already important to you. And certainly with people in my circles having children, everybody has adapted to this using the interests that already existed to them. So I have friends who are artists who've, become obsessed with depictions of the Madonna and Child and other sort of depictions of motherhood in painting history. I've, had people who were into fashion who became very into baby clothes. So everybody has their own filter that they put on it. I think people who love reading tend to try and interpret lots of things through reading anyway and through literature. And the fun thing about literature, I think, is that something doesn't need to be directly about something in order to have resonance with it. So although there might not be so many stories directly about babies, there's interest to be found even in seeking out the disappearing babies. There's stories about young women that can be transposed. There's poetry, which sometimes you can be unsure what it even is about, and yet it can speak to that experience. So literature is both endlessly rich for talking about anything, and yet sometimes has these holes in it that either need to be filled or if nothing else for the protagonist, there's a moment where it doesn't quite come up to the level. And so I think that's Madeleine discovering that her great passion in life is not quite answering the questions that she has and going out to find the answers, both through literature and life.
One of the things that about all your literary sources that I love is that they're not merely, they appear sometimes as kind of epigraphs at the beginning of chapters, but they also find their way into the as I said before, Madeleine's consciousness, and they start to even kind of invade on the page itself. And I wonder how much of that is, drawn from direct citation, and how much of it is you sort of creating a new kind of fairy mythology that then kind of mixes in with what we think of as the main kind of text.
I think with a lot of the literature citations, I made Madeleine a literature scholar with some experience in fairies so that she would have a reason for her particular break with madness to take her down this particular spiral about changelings. But I think the literature and all the quotations in general were also sort of my helpmates when writing, as somebody who was trying to embark on this very large project, a literary novel, which sort of comes with less of a formula or a guide to follow. And these authors, not all of them, but many of them are authors who are very important to me. And I kind of felt like it was my way of having them coming along on the journey with me in telling this story. So that's a side of it.
One of my last questions for you is that I love the cover so much of the novel, and I wondered if it depicts a what appears to be a woman's ear with a moth earring, but then also a live moth sort of dangling from the lobe. And I wonder if it's from a work of art that you knew or were familiar with, and whether or not you, had some say in how the cover came into being.
I had feedback on the cover, although the original covers that I was presented with were more or less this one. We spent a bit of time arranging insects and things. but the ear was already there. It is a great cover. It's one that kind of you discover new things about it regularly, or at least I do. The moth earring, which you talk about, was very much a thing that I wanted. I didn't specify earring, but I did specify moth, which is another one of my urban animals in this story. And
yeah, do you want to say why the moth is important?
So the novel begins and ends with a quotation from Virginia Woolf again, from her essay, The Death of the Moth, which is a direct quotation from the moth in that essay saying, "Life is stronger than I believe." And this is kind of the novel's thesis in a way that, that babies are born, it doesn't always go according to plan, bad things can happen, but the actual force of life is stronger than all of that, which is why it both begins and ends with this and kind of brings it around in a cyclical way. And I just felt that this moth, although it really only appears in the first and last chapter, was very emblematic of the whole thing. I also liked it as just a kind of a word nerd. I liked it because moth and mod sound quite a bit alike.
Oh,
and
yeah.
moth is also the first.
You are a word nerd.
Yeah. And moth is also the first 4 letters of mother, to the point where every time I typed the name of the essay, The Death of the Moth, I accidentally typed The Death of the Mother, and then was like, no. The moth is everything. The moth is very important. Moths are also very very often depicted in Victorian drawings, and the Victorian era has a lot to do with this book. So I knew I wanted a moth. But something that I didn't actually notice about this cover until a friend pointed it out was that the woman's ear actually looks a lot like an embryo on an ultrasound.
Oh, wow. Now I see it.
So that was cool.
Oh, I didn't see it before, but yeah,
like
it really
months.
does.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, that just now jumps out. Well, I'm glad listeners here will be able to see it right away, because now I can't stop. Before I let you go, Emily, I'd love to know if there are things that you've been reading and loving recently.
Yes. The most recent thing I read is a book I've been to read for a decade and finally got round to. This is Roberto Bolaño's Distant Star, which is about the military coup in Chile in the 1970s, in which their democratically elected president was deposed by an American-backed coup. But it's also about literature, it's about poetry, it's about violence, and it was just a wonderful book. I'd had it recommended to me many times. It's a novella, it's only about 150 pages, but it kind of crams into those 150 pages everything you might get in one of Bolaño's larger novels, which tend to be very large. And I've also...
Yeah, I agree. I love Distant Star.
Yeah, exactly. And I've also been I've read my first Helen Garner book. This is an Australian author. I read The Children's Back as in the musician, which is a very, very thin little book. Again, I quite like thin little books about a slightly dysfunctional family in Melbourne, which doesn't in any way sell it, but there's something about the writing of it that is just wonderful. So those are 2 of my...
She's having a real moment right now, I feel like, even though she's been writing for decades. She's sort of taken off, I think.
Yes, at least I think she was perhaps already a big thing in Australia, but she's come to the rest of us.
Those are great recommendations. I love both of those novels, and I'll be excited for listeners to explore them. But I want them first to run out to their local independent bookstore and get Queen Mab by Emily McBride, a novel about fairies and changelings, but also a very serious exploration of what it means to one's sense of self and time and importance to the world when you have a child. And it was such a pleasure to get to talk to you about it, Emily.
Such a pleasure. Thank you for these wonderful skill testing questions that really made me think.
Well, you answered them wonderfully, so thank you so much. Well, that's all from me for now. My thanks to Emily McBride for coming on to talk about her debut novel, Queen Mab. You can find links to purchase Queen Mab and all of Emily's recommended books at the website, burnedbybooks.com. There you'll find all of our previous episodes, links to buy a brand new podcast t-shirt or sweatshirt, and ways to get in contact. As you listen, take a moment to rate the show on iTunes, Spotify, and now YouTube, or wherever you find your podcasts. Until next time, this has been Burned by Books.
I'm not giving up. I am selling the building.
The final season of FX's The Bear.
The restaurant is flooded.
Everything's either going to be okay.
No, stop.
Or not.
We are outgunned and we are outmanned, but we have each other.
FX's The Bear, the final season. All episodes now streaming on Disney+.